The election of 1896 holds a definitive role in the history of American politics, not because of the popularity of the election, but because of the crazy political tactics that America witnessed for the first time. These new and what were viewed as extreme political tactics stemmed from both the candidates who ran as well as the issues of the United States at that time. In an election that can only be viewed as city versus country, a demographic divide began to form in the United States. The 1890s are termed as the age of urbanization. In the year 1890, nearly 35% of the United States lived in urban areas. People in the nation were moving to the city in search of jobs due to the hard economic times of the 1890s. The Panic of 1893 had the United States in an economic depression. The depression was caused by the failure of both the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad and the National Cordage Company, which were both of the country's businesses with the largest number of employees. There was a stock market panic, high unemployment rates, and bankruptcies across the country. This depression started a free silver movement, in which would allow farmers to pay off their debts with a cheaper dollar. Due to the divide between farmers and city workers, two candidates would need to emerge that represent the two extremes in the nation. William McKinley's campaign was unlike those that had run before him. McKinley was steered by his campaign manager, a man by the name of Mark Hanna. Hanna financed McKinley's entire campaign and pioneered many new strategies that would come to define the handbook of how to win an election for years to come. The Panic of 1893 created a climate of economic division in the country, and W.J. Bryan's ill-funded campaign had the emotional appeal to the working man of freeing up silver to be used to back currency. McKinley, vehemently opposed to the idea of free silver, had a tough battle to fight in order to sway the American people to his side. The economy had been crippled by the panic 3 years earlier, and average Americans were looking for a way out. Mark Hanna started by setting up two substantial campaign offices, one in Chicago and one in New York. The Chicago campaign office would be used as a headquarters for the voice of the campaign. The message and education aspects of the campaign would be coordinated from here. The New York office, personally headed up by Hanna, would be used primarily for fundraising. Many titans of industry donated to the McKinley campaign, including Mark Hanna's close personal friend, John D. Rockefeller. This method of financing was an unprecedented move for a presidential campaign. Up until that point, most campaign financing came from current office holders cutting a portion of their pay to donate to the campaign. When it was all said and done, Hanna had rose a $3.5 million budget, a sum of money that was grossly unprecedented for the time, and nowhere close to what W.J. Bryan was able to muster. In order to convince Americans that the gold standard was still effective, the McKinley campaign set off on a mission to educate the populace. This massive budget was used to create pamphlets, posters, and flyers explaining the benefits of the gold standard and the downsides to free silver. These papers flooded the country, and almost every town in America was plastered with pro-McKinley propaganda. Printed speeches were widely distributed. The McKinley campaign sought to massively outspend the competition, a goal they accomplished readily. There was no way Bryan could keep up. McKinley's goal was to convince Americans that free silver would, in fact, hurt the economy, not help it. Aside from campaign spending, McKinley, Hanna, and the rest of his campaign was determined to hit Bryan where it hurt. The Republicans focused on brutal character attacks, accusing Bryan of being a dangerous religious fanatic as well as a dangerous economic revolutionary who would single-handedly decimate the American economy. The Times, which supported McKinley, published a series of articles in which prominent analysts discussed quite seriously whether Bryan was crazy. One expert wrote, "I don't think Bryan is ordinarily crazy, but I should like to examine him as a degenerate." The piece interviewed so-called experts from the psychiatric field that concluded he suffered from megalomania, delusions of grandeur, and querulent logorrhea, a disease in which one complains too much. In stark contrast to Bryan's fast-moving campaign, where he traveled all around the country and spoke to various voters in their homes and in town halls across the country, McKinley chose a front porch campaign and decided that he would let the voters come to him. Mark Hanna tried in vain to persuade him otherwise, but eventually conceded and began the exhausting effort of shipping voters to McKinley's doorstep. Hanna would eventually secure approximately 500,000 voters to travel by train to McKinley's home, where the campaign had organized a comprehensive schedule of events designed specifically to overwhelm and persuade voters to their cause. All of McKinley's speeches were written and planned and as soon as they were given, were sent out by telegraph to newspapers all across the country. From his front stoop, McKinley had the ear of the entire country. William Jennings Bryan faced much controversy from within his own party. Many Democrats were unwilling to back him as they felt he was not a true Democrat. Many of the traditional backers of the Democratic Party, such as northern newspapers, refused to back him. This left Bryan lagging behind McKinley financially. He was able to raise a sum of $500,000. Bryan gained some of his money by passing the hat around at his rallies. Bryan was able to gather the support of southern newspapers and those of western silver states. Other supporters were businessmen with an interest in silver mining. His support was strongest in the South, Midwest, and Rocky Mountain states.
Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
True to his Gold Cross speech, silver was the major issue of Bryan's campaign. Trying to gather the votes of agrarian America, Bryan pushed the issue of a crusade of the working man against the rich. He felt that the rich had impoverished America by limiting the money supply by relying on the gold standard. If the ample supply of silver available were made into currency, America's prosperity could be restored while also undermining the power of money trusts. By using silver to back the money, there would be an inflation in the prices farmers received for their crops, allowing them to overcome debt incurred from the Panic of 1893. Bryan appealed to urban workers by stating their only way to be prosperous again was to allow farmers to prosper first. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country. Bryan was not afraid to ask the people for their vote. Focusing his campaign on farmers facing economic depression as a result of the Panic of 1893, Bryan took his campaign to the people. He operated a daunting whistle-stop tour which lasted from September 11, 1896 to November 1, 1896. Bryan traveled 18,000 miles by train. This vigorous national speaking tour allowed him to speak to the voters directly, the first to do so since Stephen Douglas. He drew large crowds because of his great oratory skill and the novelty of seeing a presidential candidate speak in person. Bryan gave 500 speeches in 100 days, speaking to several million people. The bulk of October, he spent in the Midwest, giving 160 of his final 250 speeches. In this tour, he focused heavily on the issue of silver. Bryan was able to visit 27 of the 45 states. He concluded his American tour by canvassing Nebraska in the final days before the election, giving 27 speeches, 7 of those in Omaha. William McKinley defeated William Jennings Bryan in a victory of 271 to 176 electoral votes. He also had the popular vote of 7,104,779 to Bryan's 6,502,925. This election shows the struggle between rural and city Americans, based upon the issue of the gold standard. The silver standard would have benefited farmers, but remaining with the gold standard helped industrial workers more. Another factor that contributed to McKinley's win was that many lower-class laborers voted with the political labor bosses who supported McKinley. Another key difference in the campaign mechanisms was Bryan conducted a whistle-stop campaign and McKinley conducted a front porch campaign. Bryan went across the country to the voters, but McKinley let the voters come to him. This election had the first smear campaign, the practice of bashing the opponent, which has continued to this day.